there are a number of firsts today. I think it's the first, well, I know it's the first president emeritus to present in this building. It's not perhaps our school. I'm not really sure. One would have to be a historian. It may also be the first time we have a spacecraft engineer presenting. Because for those of you who, everybody I think knows, this person doesn't need an introduction, but Dr. Likins was an engineer at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory at the California Institute of Technology and professor of engineering at UCLA. Before he was provost at Columbia, president at Lehigh, and then ultimately our 18th president of the University of Arizona. And he's known for many things, one of which is that during his period as our leader, Campaign Arizona was the thing that raised $1.something billion to create the university as we know it today. And it was, of course, during that time that the relationships with John Doris Norton and Francis McClelland and Norman McClelland and the people that kind of helped us transform the Norton School began. And so we're grateful for his leadership, his historic leadership of the school. Another first is that I bet this is the first time we have a National Wrestling Hall of Fame member present to the Norton School. So there's much about Dr. Likins as a many talented person. And if you haven't read it yet, his book, A New American Family, A Love Story, is a great telling of his own story and the story of his family. And when it came out, we began conversations about how could he interact with us around family science and family studies. So it's a great honor to have him here. So please welcome.
Thank you, Stephen. That's a wonderful introduction. As you can imagine, in the last 50 years, I've been introduced many, many times in many different ways. But the introduction I most enjoy goes something like this. Pete Likins, he's that old guy. He's that old, straight, white, Catholic, male, engineer, academic administrator, a former wrestler, and a former Republican. I love that introduction because while it's strictly true, it creates such a sharp image, not a lovable image, but a very sharp image. It's all based on stereotypes. You associate feelings with these words. And that's what we're talking about today, really, stereotypes, right? The first books I wrote reflect that image. I brought copies. Dynamics of Flexible Spacecraft, 1971. Elements of Engineering Mechanics, 1973. Spacecraft Dynamics, 1983. These are books that come from the head. My head and the head of some collaborators. Two of these books have co-authors. And today I want to talk about a book that comes from the heart. This New American Family love story. When I put pen to paper, I wasn't writing the book at all. I was writing a love letter to my wife in a journal that I gave her on our 51st wedding anniversary, December of 2006. And then on November 4th, 2008, my fellow citizens elected to the presidency of the United States of America a man of mixed race, born to a white woman and a black man, just as two of my children were. And I began to wonder if maybe our story was more than just reminiscence for family members, but was perhaps an American story, a story to the American people, a love letter to my country, if you will. Tough love because it's not a simple story, and it's not easy for Americans to receive what I have to say. But maybe that's why I have to say it. We have to talk today, as I present in the book, about bias and prejudice, about stereotypes associated with race or sexual orientation unwed mothers, schizophrenia, drug addiction, all part of my family experience, all part of the American family experience. I suspect that the people assembled in this room today have somewhat weaker negative biases in association with all those words than the general population. Weaker maybe, but not necessarily, than the biases you have in response to the words I used in my introduction. The point is, we all have biases. We all carry negative images in our minds, feelings, if not thoughts, in response to certain words or people. And biases are very hard to root out. I think as we understand the research on the brain and the years that lie ahead, we'll discover that logic is done here and these biases are somewhere else, more deeply rooted in the brain. Hard to remove, hard to deal with. But unless and until we as a country understand how to get past some of the biases I've been talking about, and I don't mean just race, but all these other biases, and I could throw religion into that conversation, unless we learn to get past the negative feelings we have about differences, we're not going to realize the dream that we have as a country. And I believe we can. This is a positive story. This is my positive experience after lots of years of overcoming challenges. I'm going to talk today about a single family, but as I talk about my family, I want you to think about your family, your extended family, grandparents or grandchildren, and ask yourself if any of my experiences are reflected in or shared by your own family. And as we get through this process, we'll talk about the American family and think about where the American family is today and where it's going. Where we're going to be in the next 20 to 40 years. Of course, demographers and other social scientists routinely analyze the statistics that define the characteristics of the American population and American families, and extrapolate those statistics to make judgments about a generation later, even more than that. And that's good stuff. Everything we know about the future, every projection we make, has to be rooted in factual studies, statistical studies of large populations. But I really believe that statistical analysis can be deeply enriched by case studies, by serious thought about individual cases, individual families, such as my own. They not only enrich and humanize the data, they also sometimes stimulate questions that might not otherwise occur to the social scientist. And you know what research is all about? It's about asking the right questions, right? Not about getting the answers. That's the hard part in terms of time and effort. But research is about asking the right questions. That's true no matter what field you're working in. You ask the right questions, and you're famous. So I do think that case studies can help you as scientists ask the right questions. We will talk about my family. We will recognize that the statistical studies are critical, but we'll also understand that there's a danger coming out of the statistical analyses that we don't often think about. And that is, they show clearly trends toward an interracial society that has very different attitudes towards sex, whether it's sex between people of the same sex and gender or not, whether it's before marriage or after. Sex is changing. Attitudes toward sex are changing in American society. Attitudes toward women are changing. Most of the bachelor's degrees, most of the master's degrees, most of the doctorates in America are now awarded to women, and it's a knowledge-based society. There is a transformation of power occurring, whether we know it or not. Has to happen. And the trouble with all of these trends is that old folks like me old white men are horrified by these trends. They see it as decline. They see it as decline from the golden age of the 50s, when everything was in its place, rich opportunities, and they forget, or maybe they never knew, maybe we never knew, that it was a golden age for us, for straight white Christian males. Certainly not for women, certainly not for people of color. My God, if you exposed a sexual orientation that was not strictly male, you didn't have a chance. Christians had an overwhelming advantage in our society. So it was a golden age for me. Gosh, I got out of high school in 1953, and bachelor's in 57, and master's in 58, and on working at JPL for 2 years, the first 2 years of the space age, after my doctorate at 1964. It was just an incredible opportunity. Everybody paid my bills. Incredible opportunity. And it never occurred to me that I was a special case, that I had a competitive advantage that I hadn't earned just from who I was. So damn it, the 50s were not a golden age for America. They were a golden age for a minority of Americans. I happened to be among them. The golden age lies yet ahead if we can learn to create opportunities genuinely for everybody, without regard for race or sex or sexual orientation or personal history or parentage or any of these considerations that currently define opportunity in our society. And that's a noble goal. It's a vision to dream for. But it is what America's supposed to be all about. And it's worth working toward that. In order to do that, you have to humanize the trends, the statistical trends in the American family. And in a tiny effort to begin that process for me, I tell the story of our family, which is a case study for a family studies class, because we got a little of everything here. Okay, let's start with an introduction to the kids in 1972. Maybe I should turn this thing on first. There they are. There are 6 of them, not 12. I don't want you to get the impression because there are 2 screens. 1972 was our first year together. There's a pointer here, isn't that snazzy? She was then 10, 9, 8, 7, 4, 3. But I'll talk about these children right now just to describe the circumstances of their adoption. They're all California kids, born in the 1960s. But I'll talk about them in the sequence of their adoption rather than the sequence of their age. She was, whoops, how did I do that? There we go. She was adopted when I was still in graduate school. My wife and I met when I was 13 at a junior high school graduation dance, and you'll see later our photograph of our engagement. Married when I'm 19, and so for 10 years I'm going to school, she's going to school, we're going to school. At this stage, she was not going to school, and I was finishing my doctorate, and we had an opportunity in California to adopt this little girl. And in California, this was an informal, not an institution-based adoption, not an agency-based adoption. So it was just an exchange between doctors and lawyers, and theoretically anonymous. But we met her when she was 8 hours old and took her home when she was 3 days old, and she was our baby. Took her for her first physical at Stanford Hospital, and the doctor said, "Do not adopt this child. She'll never live. She has a hole between 2 chambers of her heart. She's too small for surgery. She will not live long enough to grow large enough for surgery. Do not adopt this child." And this woman just did not understand that she was our child. Now, I literally sunk to the floor. I mean, it's sunk to the floor. And my wife, who is much tougher than I, you'll discover, she really is the driving force behind all of this. She held her ground and took back her baby, and we went home and raised that baby. And she was watched by pediatricians for a decade. Gradually, the hole between the chambers of her heart grew together. She ran track in high school with doctor's approval. She's now a 49-year-old nurse here in Arizona. So, it was a good story, but a story that just in retrospect was an adoption of a child who, for a reason of medical infirmity, would not have been adopted had she gone through the kind of formal institution-based procedures. Just before I left my doctoral studies for UCLA, we adopted a second child. And he had Mexican-American birth mother, German-American birth father. That was not a big deal in our minds. Retrospectively, it was a significant violation of the cultural norms of the 1960s. And then this child, 5 years to the day younger than Laura. This is Laura, this is Krista. My wife was home with the measles. I'm trying to do my job at UCLA. I come home at the end of the day and find that she's been watching movies that day. And between two feature films, it was a 15-minute program hosted by a guy named Ben Hunter called Adoption Interviews. And he placed on the screen children who were, quote, unadoptable by category. Black or brown, Asian, too old, ill in some way. He believed that if we, the audience, could look beyond the category and see the child, that somebody would fall in love. And my wife told me when I got home that day, well, she might as well have said, honey, I'm pregnant. She said, we're going to have another baby. And the fact that this child is black, that is born to a white mother with a black father, I can't remember much talk about that. This was just a beautiful little baby that my wife fell in love with, and I fell in love with my wife a lot earlier, and that settles the deal, right? And you can't raise a black kid in a white household, in a white neighborhood, in a white job. You can't do that all by yourself, so you need another black child. We told the social workers, we need another black child. And they brought us, less than a year later, they brought us John. Similar story, white mother, black father. So here we were, 4 kids. I grew up in a family with 4 kids, so did my wife. Here I'm making my way at UCLA. I guess I just got full professor that year, as a matter of fact, as I think about it. So I'm doing fine, feeling good, 4 kids. That's a good job, that's a good life. And then my wife watched that damn show one more time. And she saw this beautiful 10-year-old girl. She looks now as she did on that TV screen. And that was a tough question, because 10 years can create permanent changes in a human being, and they had to be 10 tough years. Living in a reservation, mother and father both dead, alcohol explained both of those fatalities. She had a half a dozen brothers and sisters, but she was a beautiful child, and we talked to our 9-year-old and our 8-year-old. I think these kids didn't quite understand what was going on, and we said, are you ready for this? And my kids understand adoption. And they understood they'd have to share, but they also understood that this little girl has a family. And so we adopted Teresa. Well, Teresa came as part of a package deal because she said, I'll go to your family if you bring my sister, Linda. Linda was 7. Whole new set of challenges. She'd been classified as retarded. She didn't know any of the letters of the alphabet. If she was playing outside and she needed to pee, she'd just squat and pee like a wild animal. But we decided we could we could handle that, and we brought in Teresa and Linda. So that's the family. Now, whose idea was this? Who's the crazy, creative dreamer who thinks up things like this. Was it this guy? No. No, it was not this guy. I don't think I had enough imagination to dream the dreams that I have lived in my lifetime, whether it relates to family or anything else. But I do want you to see the cabin in the back, because that's where I came from. There's the cabin again, and my older brother and younger brother in a bassinet. Little two-room shack, and there's a lot of development in the book about that life experience, what that cabin was like, and I loved that cabin. But we were poor. We didn't have much in the way of luxuries or health care. I mean, you know, we lived, I had my tonsils taken out in the doctor's office because he knew the hospital would send us a bill, and we knew he wouldn't. And doctors don't normally take tonsils out in the doctor's office, right? But in a lot of ways, we got by. My mother raised 4 kids in that cabin. My father had led the scene, and those were really powerful, formative years for me. You know how it is. It makes you or it breaks you. This is the girl that I met at this junior high school dance. You see there's an enormous diamond. Well, maybe you can't see the diamond, but you can see the ring, right? I had received a scholarship from the California Scholarship Federation for $250, and that bought that ring. Had a scholarship from Bank of America, that bought the car. And Stanford paid for the rest of it, and off I went. So here we are, my 18th birthday, engaged. What do you think Mama thinks about that? Boy, think about it. And then at 19, I'm a junior in college, and I decide it's time to get married. And in California at that time, a young man couldn't marry under 21 without parental approval. My mother had to sign her name. Poor woman. But you know, by that time I'd been out of the house since I was 16 and on my own, and I said, "Mama, sign it." And she signed it. She said, "You'll never get out of college." And you know, I never did until I was 70. So here's the girl at 20, now leap 17 years. Here she is at 37, surrounded by these kids in a cap and gown, because we postponed her education so I could finish my master's degree, and then she started over again at Pasadena City College while I was working at JPL, and she did really well, and she transferred to Stanford, so I went up to Stanford for my doctorate. She's working on her bachelor's degree. I've got a Ford Foundation fellowship. She's got me. No money. We paid her tuition until we ran out of money. She dropped out again. And all these kids, and with 4 kids in the family, she said, "I'm going back." We were living in the San Fernando Valley and close to Cal State Northridge. And she started taking classes at Cal State Northridge. And with 6 kids, she got her bachelor's degree. Amazing woman. Absolutely amazing woman. But here you see the set. And here we are. I'm going to show you a number of photographs that are intended to convey a sense that this is just a normal family. It may look a little weird at first. And when we move into a new neighborhood or into a new school, go to church, people look at us, but then they stop looking at us, and we're just another family. Adoption becomes so normal to us that one of our kids, when they came back from the first grade for the first time, said, "You know, Mama, lots of kids in school live with the lady who made them." If you have enough adopted kids, they think it's normal. And our kids, we think we are normal. And you know, these, of course, we're not all the same. That's different. But we're not all equally tall. Most of us are not tall at all. We're not all equally skillful in athletics or in school. We're not all the same color. That's just one of the many differences that separate the kids in my family. At this point, this is the Lehigh University campus, and the oldest daughter, Teresa, finished high school and started nursing college and didn't really make it, and stayed working in a hospital in New Jersey. So the rest of us moved to Pennsylvania. Now I'm going to tell you in a moment a story about each of these kids. And you're going to see that there's a lot of tough stuff coming down. We don't quite see it at this stage of our family's development, but there's some tough years that lie ahead. Who's that young man? That's Tom. He was born to her, as she likes to say, and a passing Irishman. I'll tell you, the Irishman had some pretty good genes because Tom's a remarkable young man. Born to her. We brought her back, remember I told you she stayed in New Jersey when the family moved to Pennsylvania. We brought her back into the arms of the family. And raising the baby was kind of a family project. And at one point, my wife and I were at a wrestling tournament with him, and our two daughters, this daughter and this daughter, announced that they're changing roles. That mom's going to become the aunt and the aunt's going to become the mom. And we said, wait a minute, do you know what you're doing? And my daughters said to my wife, back off. It's not your decision. So we backed off. And Tom, here, was raised as the adopted child of my daughter Laura, born to my daughter Teresa. Here's Tom again. Oops, darn, oops, what am I going to do now? Here's Tom again in a more recent photograph with my daughter Krista. And he's a college graduate and he's just a sweet, wonderful guy. That's a success story. First class success story. Krista, my wonderful Krista, had some tough years in her life. Drugs and other kinds of mental crises afflicted her. Although you see she's a healthy young person now. She's not a young person, she's in her 40s, but she looks young. Anyway, Krista made two babies. They were both adopted by my niece and nephew. My sister's daughter and her husband. They were living in Washington. She's a teacher, he's an engineer. Ultimately, we bought for them a house in Tucson, and he's working for Raytheon. We set them up just to kind of 100 yards down the road so our grandkids would still be close to us. It was beautiful. And then they got divorced. So Christian, now 15, getting beyond the book now, lives with my daughter Laura, the same Laura who adopted Tom. She is his legal guardian, and they're in a house 100 yards down the road that we bought for my two daughters. Fortunately, although I had no money in my childhood, and I earned no money as a professor, I made money in other ways in the stock market, and so we could afford to buy houses for these kids. We're going to talk about race as we go along here. What race are these kids? Well, their mother's black. Well, by our social conventions, and their mother's black. What about this guy? Well, his birth mother is Native American, American Indian. But these youngsters, there's another one. These youngsters represent a population in America that is exploding, an interracial population. The most rapidly growing population in America. Between the year 2000, when you were first permitted to check more than one race box on the census form, and the year 2010 grew by 33%. And the growth in the future is absolutely guaranteed. For one thing, interracial people make interracial babies, right? But for another thing, it's becoming more socially acceptable to say, I don't have to choose, I can be both. And so people will check 2 boxes who a decade ago checked just 1. So it's a dramatically changing population. And when we try to think about the future, you see a lot of studies that show the rate of growth of the Hispanic population, or the black population, or the Asian population, and the white population, which by 2050 becomes a minority, as I hope you all realize. You see these statistics, and it is as though the people doing the studies imagine that we will always measure people the same way we now do, in lumps, half a dozen different categories. And what's going to happen inexorably, without anybody making any decisions, is that the boundaries between the races are going to get so blurry that people like this little girl and like the 2 in the preceding photograph create fuzzy boundaries between these categories. It's as though we've always thought of ourselves as islands of race, separated by narrow bridges. And we're creating a kind of a merged, mushy space in between these islands. That is not just a guess, that is a guarantee. That's what's happening in America. And I think most of us haven't really faced that. Even people who are very proud of their ethnicity and who intend to propagate it forever haven't dealt with the fact that the boundaries are going to get soft. And it's going to get hard to label a large population of Americans. Who is she? Well, this wonderful son of mine, whom you'll meet in some detail shortly, got his girlfriend pregnant when he was 17. And my wife, my amazing wife, knew that some friends of ours were looking for a child to adopt, and so she arranged for the Liebermans, our family friends, to adopt this child who became Paige Lieberman. And eventually, Paige came to understand, although she was about 20 at the time, that the family friends, the Likinses, whom she knew and loved from years of relationship, were actually her grandparents, and that their son John was her birth father. And so, she's my grandchild. I've known that for all these years, but she's just recently she became aware of that 3 years ago. Now, there's a sequel to this story. Are you ready for this? I'm an old man and I'm still finding surprises in my life. A couple of months ago, I got an email from a young woman who said, my name is Crystal Dobbs. I'm 15. I was adopted by my grandmother at birth. And today she showed me my birth certificate. And your son, John Patrick Likins, is my birth father. Well, it happened that we knew that John had made a girl pregnant. I don't want to get ahead of the John story, but I'll just drop in a little bit of a tidbit. We knew that John had made a girl pregnant, not just this girl, but 10 years later, not just the mother of this girl, but 10 years later, the mother of another child. We had no idea where all this had gone in the murky, cloudy world in which we live. But this young lady announced herself. She had looked up my son online, watched him wrestle the state championships in Pennsylvania, 15 years ago, or 20, 30 years ago. She had found my book and got a copy and decided that it was safe to send me an email. And so I met her 10 days ago for the first time in my life, and her mom and her dad and her brother living in Burbank, California. So she too, like this girl, is a product of my son, who is black, right? More or less. What is she? I don't know. This is a bit of a sidelight. As I talk about what's happening to America, and I want to talk about the complexity and diversity of our society, I realize that in my immediate family, that is my children and grandchildren, I have no experience with physical disability. And so I go back to This young man, my wife's brother, who at 15 was having a tough time in a very difficult family situation, a family situation my wife understood very well because she grew up in that same family. And so we, at 22, became the surrogate parents of this 15-year-old troubled boy. And he lived with us for 2 years in Pasadena. This is a high school photograph. And to avoid making this into a long story, I ended up with a bachelor's degree and a career in the military and retired as a major and was flying drums of gasoline into the outback as a bush pilot in Alaska, flipped his plane, broke his neck. He's been a quadriplegic for 20 years. And an amazing man. A man who's dealt with that disability with courage. There was a time when he was able with great difficulty to walk. He can't do so now. He got a job in the Alaska high schools teaching our OTC and coaching the rifle team. He made a life for himself despite being a quadriplegic. I'm going to quickly go through our children now and give you some sense of what's happened to them. This is the baby Laura with a hole between the chambers of her heart, and my wife in 1963. Laura to the right, Paul, the little youngster who was, as I said, born to a Mexican-American woman. Beautiful little boy. Laura as a nurse. Paul, more recently. Paul's gay. And that was a shocker for an old man from the 50s. People of my generation, men particularly, just didn't know how to handle that because it was invisible in my childhood life. And when my son began rebelling and acting out in ways that belied the fact that he was the smartest kid in the family, he was determined to flunk out of school twice, college twice, drinking too much. At some point I said to his sister, "Laura, is Paul gay?" He was 18. And she said, "Ask him, Dad." Why didn't I ask him 5 years earlier? He said, "Duh, of course, Dad. Figure it out." And we have become very close. In fact, this very day, I'm taking precious time away from that son because he's visiting from New York with his partner. He's got a master's degree from NYU, and he works, of all places, in the Wall Street Journal and online advertising, and we have a great relationship. But it was not an easy transition. Not easy at all. And only more recently, we've come to realize that he's gay too. Remember, he was born to my daughter, Teresa, adopted by my daughter, Laura, a very enlightened, open-minded person. And when Tom, in his teenage years, began to come to grips with his own sexuality, it was not a difficult thing for him to figure it out, and his wife, his mom and his grandparents to understand that this was an interesting and complex dimension of our grandson Tom, whom we loved beyond all words. The change in one generation from my son Paul to my grandson Thomas is deeply gratifying. I can only begin to imagine what it must have been like for people of my age to deal with their sexual orientation. So, life has its complexities. Here's Paul. Big, strong guy. There's Krista. Krista, 68's the year of her birth, so she's just a little kid there, and that polka dot is her mama's leg. She's hanging on for dear life, and she was emotionally very needy and loved to be loved. And here's Krista in high school. As you see, Krista is a beautiful girl. And Krista is now 45, and she's a beautiful woman. But there have been some tough years in the space between. Tough years. Here she is in 2010. And I love her very much, but she's had some tough years. And one thing we've learned in our family is you don't give up on your kids. This is a kid that was particularly challenging. This is John. I'm sure you can see the sparkle in his eye, no matter how far back you are in this room. This is an extraordinary human being. John has been a delight from early childhood. I could tell John stories for the rest of the day or 2 or 3 days more, but I've noticed that this is a student-centered research university. You know what that means? It means the clock is visible to you and not visible to your professor. That's what a student-centered research university is all about. But John turned out to have extraordinary gifts as a wrestler. So here he is, a New Jersey state champion for his age group, and my wife and I were wrestling coaches. I have a wrestling history of my own, and so I could talk for 3 days about wrestling stories, but I better not do that either. John, in high school, was a very serious wrestler and a state champion in the state of Pennsylvania, where wrestling is a very serious sport. Good student. Anybody remember break dancing? Anybody old enough to remember break dancing? John was a break dancer. He'd break dance on the stage for incredibly talented in body control, which break dancers need and which wrestlers need. He was a good student. After he won the state championship as a junior, he was offered a scholarship at the University of Pittsburgh, a wrestling scholarship, if he just finished his senior year, but he didn't. In the spring of John's junior year in high school, 17, Pat found a marijuana pipe in his back pocket. And my wife has always been the eagle eye. She detects any little departure from norm. And John was a straight kid. I mean, he didn't smoke, and his drinking was interesting because I drank a lot in high school, frankly. A lot of trouble along that road. And John didn't match me by any measure. But one day he was sitting in the living room watching television with his friends, with his siblings, not his friends, his siblings. And Pat took a glass of grape juice away because the carpet was new and she didn't want to stain the carpet, and it was full of red wine. We realized that he was kind of drinking the wine by himself because it made him calm. And that troubled us. We also realized that there were times when John would sit in the basement. This is Pennsylvania, a 4-story president's house at Lehigh University. The basement floor is covered with wrestling mats. He would sit in the dark, all lights out, no sounds, just to sit there by himself. Is he meditating? Well, in retrospect, we know what he was doing is suppressing those stimuli, auditory and visual stimuli, that created for him stress and anxiety, because he was in fact manifesting early stages of schizophrenia. But we didn't know that. What do we know? All we know is this wonderful kid is suddenly smoking pot. And we got him to see a counselor, and the psychologist said, after lots of tests, he said, this is a great kid, he's got good values, but there's something here I don't understand. And we didn't go very far with that. We didn't go anywhere with that. We just let that thought percolate in the back of our mind. He escalated to snorting cocaine. We took him to a 30-day rehab. Took him out of high school. 30-day rehab. Upscale psychiatrists and nurses and social workers and drug counselors, and 30 days, and then he's out and he's using drugs again. Put him in a 90-day rehab run by recovering addicts in Erie, Pennsylvania. Tough kind of a place. They did a whole lot better job than the professionals, if I may say so. And he got back in school. He finished his high school year. He didn't win the states that year as a senior, but he took second in the states. He was doing fine. He went off to Pitt on a scholarship, and over the Christmas holidays of his freshman year, he disappeared in the streets of Pittsburgh. The wrestling team finally found him out there somewhere, and we went to Pittsburgh, my wife and I, and brought him home, and there began a saga of 15 years of hell. John was never rebellious. Paul was rebellious. John was never rebellious. He was just determined to use drugs. And so he'd be clean and sober for a while, and then he'd go off the deep end, and we put him in a detox for 3 days, and then a rehab for 30 days, and then he's clean and sober for a while, and then he's gone again. It's difficult for me to convey the depth of our grief in this damage being done to our child. Prior to that moment, everything had gone so well, unbelievably well, and suddenly the bottom dropped out. In between one of these detoxes and his rehab, my daughter Laura was getting married, and he asked if he could go to the wedding, and she said she'd like to have him, so he came to the wedding. And my friends who knew, we were never been secretive about John's problems. Friends thought, John's back, he's laughing, he's dancing, he's having a great time. And then he stole her wedding gifts out to the streets of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And you can't let even your beloved son get away with that, or you're enabling and facilitating his behavior. And so we called the cops. Now, I was the president of Lehigh University, and that's a big deal in that small town. And he was a state champion wrestler, probably a bigger deal than I was. That's front page stuff. And there it was, John in handcuffs. I wrote an editorial or commentary for the 2 local papers. Both published the papers. They dealt factually with the arrest, but the commentary elicited 100 letters of response. Letters, remember letters? Almost all, the single exception, all saying, gee, I've got that problem in my family too. And you're the president. And if you can deal with it, I can deal with it. The one that took exception was from an addict, recovering addict, who said, I'd commented on John's extraordinary discipline. And I can't take the time to do all I'd like to do here. But John had a knee injury just before a series of tournaments, wrestling tournaments. His leg locked up and he couldn't bend it. The official learned, the trainer learned that if he just stretched the knee, it would break loose and he could use it. So he wrestled until his knee locked up, and then the trainer pulled it out and he wrestled until he won the tournament. And then he had surgery. Won the tournament on Saturday, had surgery on Monday, and wrestled again on Friday. A really tough, determined kid. And this guy who dissented from my comment on how strong John was and how unlikely it was that he could become an addict, this guy said, it's not about willpower. It's about biology. There are things going on in his brain that I don't understand, you don't understand, but it's not about willpower. One negative letter. So I survived. I submitted my resignation to the university, and they declined to accept it. And life goes on. You know? That's John in 2002. In the interim, we had interactions with various rehab centers. And I can't take the time to tell you all the really extraordinary stories, heart-wrenching and heart-lifting stories of our adventures with John. But at one point he came back from his rehab clean and sober, was living in the house with us, and months went by and he was still behaving in a weird way. We took him to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist said, John's schizophrenic. When he's 17 or so, that illness manifests itself, and he was self-medicating with alcohol and marijuana and other drugs. So now he is both an addict and a schizophrenic. That helped us to understand. Sure as hell didn't help him. And he would rather be an addict than a schizophrenic. Schizophrenia is a manageable mental illness. Medications do control symptoms. You don't cure that disease, but you can treat it effectively. But as in every other mental disease I'm familiar with, the patients don't want to take medication forever. And when they take the medication, they feel fine. If they feel fine, why do they take the medication? So they stop taking the medication, they go down the hill again, and in John's case, down the hill means back to drugs. So the adventure just became more complex. And because time is running out, I'm now going to tell you that he died. July 19th, 2002. He died in his bed. He was swallowing whatever he could find, the medications for his schizophrenia and street drugs that he was able to pick up in the way an addict will find drugs somehow, somewhere. And the combination, drugs interact in ways that we don't understand even when we're sober, right? And he died. The girls, our Indian girls, Teresa and Linda, these are both high school photographs. And I don't have many photographs that go beyond this. Teresa, who gave birth to Tom and became his aunt, and they're both from the Morongo Indian tribe in California, which has become a casino-rich tribe. And so they're well provided for, even though they live in Pennsylvania. And she has a wonderful relationship with a guy who is himself working with damaged children. He's dear to us. They're not married. I don't care. She's not married either. I do care. It's a relationship with a guy that is not, in my opinion, as noble as her partner, but I don't get to decide, right? So I'm trying to make sure you understand. I'm not just trying to paint a pretty picture here. This is complicated. This is complicated. Life is complicated. So here they are, the family. I told you to think about your family, not to think about my family. So now I'm going to ask you, show of hands, think about your extended family. Grandparents, the grandchildren. Not a lot of grandchildren reflected in this room. Is there anyone in your extended family who is a different race than you are? If so, please raise your hand. Now look around the room. Look around the room. This is everywhere. It's not just me. Is there anyone in this extended family that is mentally ill? I guess I better define the terms, right? It's interesting. We use these words mental disease and mental illness, and mostly we don't think very hard about what they mean. And I'm not sure I'm qualified to make that decision, but I'm about to anyway. We use the term illness or disease when your body's invaded by bacteria or virus, then it's unambiguous. That's what we call it, illness or disease. But we also use the word disease sometimes to describe heart disease, which is not a consequence of an invasion of bacteria or virus, not always anyhow, but maybe just a malfunction of that pump and valve system that is the heart. And we talk about Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, as diseases. And I think they're really just deterioration of the function of the brain, certain portions of the function of the brain. So what about addiction? It is a malfunction of the brain. And so in my mind, in my vocabulary, when I talk about mental illness, I include not just schizophrenia, which everybody would include, although they don't know what its source is, probably just a malfunction of some portion of the brain. And addiction, which is a malfunctioning brain, one way or the other. So, with that in mind, addiction included, remember nicotine is the most addictive drug in our field today. I'm serious, nicotine counts. How many of you have in your family anyone with a mental illness? Is there nobody in your family who smokes? Oh no, you got your hand up. Get your hand up. I guess my point is, it's everywhere, and it's complex, and it's a question of degree and specific manifestations of mental illness, but it's there. And as with sexual orientation, we've got to be open about it. The stigma that my son felt about schizophrenia was overwhelming. He didn't feel that way about being a drug addict. He'd handle that. But schizophrenia, that means I'm crazy. And we'll always be crazy. We attach a stigma to what we think of as diseases of the mind, because we create a kind of a dichotomy between mind and body. We may, depending on how we're put together in our value system and our belief system, we may think in terms of body, mind, and spirit. But still we separate mind and body. And we have a tendency historically over the centuries, millennia I suppose, to think of certain diseases as diseases not of the brain but of the mind. And when we think your mind is broken, wow, that's kind of scary. That's kind of scary. What? What did she say?
Serious talking, I'm sorry.
So we have to begin to understand mental illness as a malfunction of the brain. Just like, diabetes is a malfunction of parts of the body. Schizophrenia is a malfunction of some parts of the brain. Not something to be more ashamed of, more reluctant to talk about. Okay, it's now falling to you to say something. Because I have, just for the moment, stopped. This is not over. It's your turn. Yeah.
It's pretty interesting. It's like the discovery of your brainchild and stories of how that figured out. Do you ever hear from the bio parents of these kids?
Wonderful. Once. When Laura was 18, off to college as a freshman, just 1 month off to college, we got a letter from a woman named Carol Signet. She said, "We've never met, but I am your daughter Laura's birth mother. And when you signed the papers at Stanford, I saw your name. And I knew you were a Stanford student. And I followed you for 18 years through the Stanford Alumni Association as I moved from UCLA to Columbia to Lehigh. And I waited until my daughter was 18. And now I'm asking you, not her, you, if you can accept and even facilitate a relationship. You're the mom, but I have feelings for her too." And so we sent a letter back. We sent a letter back and said, "Yes, we'll make this happen. We want to wait until Thanksgiving, so Laura's personally home. We don't want to ship this off to Laura in her first months in college." And so when Laura came home, we shared the letter. And Laura and Carol exchanged correspondence. Remember tape recordings? They exchanged audio tapes. Laura was not ready to, Carol was in the, I guess, state of Washington. Laura was not ready to go see her for a while, but they had a relationship. And then at some point when Pat's mom and dad were driving from California to Alaska, Laura joined them in the car and went to visit this woman who had identified herself as her birth mother, developed a relationship, and we developed a relationship with that birth mother. So when she came to Pennsylvania to visit Laura, she stayed in our house because we had a big house and Laura didn't. And Carol had become just part of this extended family. At some point, with Carol's help, we tracked down the birth father. And get this, we're living in Pennsylvania, right? And my brother's son is having a wedding in Palo Alto. And I flew to Palo Alto with my daughter Laura. We went to the wedding. We met for breakfast with her birth father and his wife. Had a lovely chat. I got in an airplane and flew back to Pennsylvania, and I left Laura for several days with this stranger who was her birth father. And it worked. So at Laura's second marriage, yes, she had a divorce too. At her second marriage, which occurred in our backyard here in Pennsylvania, here in Arizona, where the hell am I? The groom had only one set of parents. And Laura had three. She had her mom and dad, and her birth mother and husband, and her birth father and husband, and that's just great. So she's got half brothers and half sisters, and she maintains a relationship. We see family differently. We see family not in terms of bloodlines. but in terms of relationships. And when somebody gets hurt or has a need, we find a way to bring them into the family. Yeah.
Your experience into a broader cross-cultural context and even into an evolutionary context, it strikes me that when you do that, your situation, albeit very atypical in terms of our ordinary experience in our culture, is not so atypical when you take a broader cross-cultural view. And many evolutionary biologists agree that we have evolved to be a cooperative breeder kind of species, which involves not necessarily adoption, but the potential for adoption is always there, because raising kids becomes a larger collective cooperative venture. So, you might say that from this broader perspective, this fits.
We're normal after all. No, I absolutely agree. Legal mechanism to accomplish what we've accomplished. It's not really about adoption. It's about bringing children into your family and helping them achieve a healthy life. And the evolutionary biologists must understand that human mobility guarantees interracial sex. Period. Guarantees it. When the white guys as pioneers were crossing into the American West, they're making babies with Indian women. So every one of us who grew up in the West has some Indian heritage. That's just the way it is, and the way it will always be. That's a biological imperative. And so as we become a more mobile society, and as people interact with one another, not just across the boundaries in our country, but around the world, we will become a more complex, less, we will not become homogeneous, but we will become a more complex distribution of humanity than we are today. Yes?
To that point, sure, biology is a piece of genetics, but our identities is lifetime. So, I just wondered, given the mix of situations and backgrounds of your family, inclusively, whether the kids struggle with that, who am I? Where do I belong? I'm a biracial or multiracial product. My child is even more, I don't even want to call him that, but it's a little mix to try to tease it into forks or eighths or something.
Yeah. Sure.
Like that. But if he's 7 or if he's 7 this month, and there are times is that person American? Am I an American? Or am I Asian? Or am I African? Or, but I don't, my family's from England, right? So, he's dealing with that complexity. And I just wonder how.
You're asking really. Questions can be asked of every adolescent, firstly, right? Every child struggles with who am I? My wife, at the age of 13, dropped a photograph of herself, broke the glass, tried to put it all together. In the back of the photograph, it had a different last name. 13, think about that. Wondering who she is, as every 13-year-old does. Went to Mama. Mama said, well, I was married once before. We didn't want to tell you. Don't tell Daddy because he would be hurt. So yeah, every child, not just dramatic examples like that, every child worries about who they are. I did. We all do. And if you're adopted, then that's another complexity, another layer of anxiety and uncertainty. And if you're multiracial, that's another level of anxiety and uncertainty, never to be denied. It's real. I was on a television interview when this book was first published, and a woman came to my home to interview me, and my daughter Krista was kind of hovering, and the interviewer said, Krista, take the chair, I want to interview you. And Krista was delightful, much more impressive in her interview than I was, I got to say. But I was out of sight, but not out of hearing distance. And the woman asked Krista, what's it like to be black in a white family? Didn't you find it difficult in some ways? Are you black? Are you white? You talk white? You look black? And she said, I was so pleased to hear. She said, we always understood that we had to find our worth in ourselves not in our identity as part of a larger enterprise. And so I am who I am first. And if somebody wants to call me names, that's their problem. Call me nigger, I don't care. That's your problem. You're sick, not me. Nothing wrong with me. And so that's what you want the child to feel. That yeah, you have all kinds of wonderfully interesting, complex relationships, cultures to be celebrated, but you are a person of worth. That's what you got to hang on to. Now, we have some kids who were born in a reservation, and Patty and my wife and I took them back to the reservation to meet with their grandmother, maybe a month or so after we'd adopted them. Grandmother was lovely and gracious. You think about all the older Indian women who remember when their white babies were stolen from them to go to school in the East. It's easy for Indian folks, American Indian folks, to really deeply resent white folks taking their babies. But she was very gracious. She knew her grandchildren had very few opportunities in the reservation. But my 10-year-old daughter was, well, indifferent. And my 7-year-old daughter said to her mom, there's two women there, grandmother and aunt, and my wife said, you should go hug your grandmother. And she said, which one is my grandmother? You know? So their connectedness with their tribal culture was very weak, and their tribal culture itself was very weak. Now, the grandson Tom, born to Teresa, is a member of the tribe. In order to be a member, you have to spend time there, learn their culture and traditions, take some courses in money management, incidentally. And Tom, with support from his mom, my daughter Laura, and my wife and myself, he went through all that, and he's proudly Indian. But it took a time lapse for another generation for Tom to begin to feel that way. And Tom's a pretty sophisticated guy. I mean, he understands. This is yeah.
Prejudice is still one of the most problematic problems in our world. And so you had to really see the manifestations of it. So how do you, after you've had these 50 years now, 40-some years to deal with it, how do you see the best way for us to move forward so that this problem that's plagued mankind forever can be dealt with?
You're right. We're talking about a species that is evolving in its attitude toward others. And I believe that the best way to overcome prejudice of an individual is through counterexample. My wife's daddy, stepfather actually, boy, he cursed black people and Japanese and anybody who was different from himself. I worked for him when he was a wood contractor and I was a slave. I worked for him. I've seen him in his daily behavior, and that we brought him a black baby. But she was a very, very appealing child, and he fell in love with her. And it's hard to be angry and prejudiced against a whole category of people if there's somewhere in that collection someone you love, someone you think is very special. And the way we as a species become so mobile and so intermixed, because I believe in the general goodness of humanity, I believe that we will increasingly have positive experiences with somebody of a different race. We may not fall in love with them, but we'll work with them in the job or get to know them in school. And it's when two groups are so separated that they can dehumanize each other, that they can really develop serious hatred. But if they're connected like this, whether it's in business or in church or in social relationships in school, when people are connected like that, it's hard to persist in these prejudices. Now, this is a world that you're talking about, not just Tucson, Arizona. So it's really, really complicated. And the prejudice is not just about race. It's very profoundly prejudiced about religion. And boy, that's very, very tough to deal with. Again, when you actually know somebody who is of a faith that you think is kind of weird, and you find out they're not weird at all, they're just different in their belief system, you begin to temper your attitudes toward that whole population. So I believe that I'm optimistic about the gradual reduction of hostilities based on differences. And that will come about only through interactions. You still got 15 minutes. Yes?
I was wondering if your children, you putting their private lives in the book, and
I wrote this book without showing it to anybody, including my wife. But between this love letter to my wife that I talked to you about and this published book, I did write a kind of a family memoir. Much, much bigger than this book. I had everything in it I'd ever thought about on any subject. And I shared that with the kids. And that disclosed all the same things. And I got no, hell, some of them didn't even read it, but I got no, negative feedback. And so when I went to this book through the University of Arizona Press, I didn't ask them. And I believe they're proud of what we've said here. Krista, I think, is sometimes kind of embarrassed because she had a period of drug abuse. She's now clean for 5 years, but in many ways undeveloped, can't get a job. So she feels, I try to get her to go to Pima, and she's afraid. She feels in many ways unhappy with herself, although she's beautiful in the soul as well as in her physical appearance. She's very much reliant upon us at this stage of life. And while she's, I think, in a certain way proud, and you notice she stepped up for that television interview. She kind of likes the glory, you know. But I think she would have complicated feelings. Paul's gay and open about it. I don't know what they'd think of the Wall Street Journal if anybody from that magazine ever read my book, because he works for them and they're very conservative and he ain't conservative. But, you know, that's life. I didn't ask my mama when I got married either, right? I didn't ask anybody when we adopted these babies. I usually don't ask. I usually just do. I will tell you just as an anecdote to help you understand my background. We'd adopted, my wife and I, 4 kids, 2 of them black. And my sister was in communication with my father in a way that I was really not. And she saw my pop and she said, Pat and Pete have adopted 2 new kids, Linda and Teresa, remember? And the old man said, I hope they're pale faces. And Katie said, no, they're Indians. He also said Martin Luther King got what he deserved. That's my father talking, right? So, we made a little progress.
what do you think it was about Pat led her into this adventure? It sounds like she really...
She and I talk a lot about the fact that we're different. And we really don't know why. I mean, she would say, well, that's just who I am. But she had a pretty rough childhood with some abuse along the way, and my father took off and left my mother with 4 little kids to take care of in difficult circumstances, and we came together very young. And I think an important part of who we are stems from the fact that we've had each other for so long. I'm about to celebrate my 57th wedding anniversary. You think about that, you know. We grew up together and we lean on each other. And some of what we survived, we could not have survived without the other. But we also look back on the time when she's raising 6 kids and she's going to school and she's doing needlepoint. I mean, where the hell does this come from? Just incredible energy and optimism. Why do we feel that the world's a good place? Well, there's a lot of evidence to the contrary, really. We don't know the answer to that, you know. You think about it a lot. Because you'd like to know, because you'd like to transfer it to your kids, who in general don't have the same kind of fearlessness. My wife is a fearless person. Absolutely fearless. She'll just jump into anything and take a hit, you know, and I'm there with her.
Did you know that when you got together with her?
Here I am, 13. Junior high school, pretty girl on the other side of the... Do you think I thought about her character? No, I just went to dance with a pretty girl. And we danced all night, and she wrote in her diary that night, the first night we met, I met the boy I'm going to marry.
What about your own children, biological children? Was that something you do?
No. Biological children, if that had been the natural course of events, but we had several miscarriages. And remember, we're looking back in the 1960s when all of these wonderfully complex technologies were not available, nor was there any money available. And adoption opened up as a possibility that her mother incidentally coordinated. Her mother said, I know a girl who's pregnant. Do you want her baby? And so it was very spontaneous for us. And once you start having children, some folks, once they adopt children, bear children, and feel good about that combination. But in many ways, I'm really pleased that we developed the family that we have, because you don't want your kids worrying about who's genetically replicating daddy or mama. And this way, we can understand, whether they can understand it or not, we can understand that our expectations of each child depend upon our assessment of each child, not upon who we are or what our capabilities are. The fact that my son is a better wrestler than I am really bugs me. But that was just the nature of his biological makeup. He's just better than I am. Okay? I mean, that's the way you have to look at these things. We're not all the same. And we have to love each other for what we can bring to the world. Are you tired? You have 3 minutes left and you're exhausted? Okay. Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, I coached, in fact, I'll tell you. My wife, of course, was my girl during my high school years of wrestling. And all during my college years of wrestling, she was right there beside me, and she knows that sport. And so when we had a 9-year-old who wanted to wrestle in Park Ridge, New Jersey, we created a wrestling team, my wife and I. And other daddies pitched in, but they didn't know how to wrestle. And we had 50, 75 kids out there from 5 to 14. But I'm working at Columbia in the city, and I'm commuting in from New Jersey, and so I can't go to practice until relatively late in the evening. And the little kids can't start that late. So she started with my son John, then probably 10. She started a wrestling program for 2nd and 3rd graders, maybe 2nd, 3rd, and 4th graders. So she'd meet with them after school and teach them wrestling. She was their coach. And then when the time came on Saturdays to have wrestling meets or tournaments, she'd fold her team on top of my team, and her team won district championships. And she has a little plaque that says, "Thanks, Coach." My wife's a wrestling coach, too. So, yeah, we coached our kids.
Not kids, I mean literally, like, really played with them physically.
Yeah. Well, you're tempting me. I just can't resist this. Those are my wrestling years. Here I'm a university president, still wrestling. This is how I met the University of Arizona in this stadium with a cheerleader on my shoulders. So yeah, I stayed rather physical. I finally reached the point which I had to tell the cheerleaders that they could not stand on my shoulders because it would damage my pacemaker. Okay, folks, that's enough. Thank you. I've enjoyed it.